can we win in Ukraine? You said, you didn't even hesitate. You said absolutely. And I agree with you. And for those people who are doubters, I make the case, first of all, that we have, between us and Europe, we have a $50 trillion economy versus two. We control sanctions. We control the economy. We control energy production. And we can undermine Russia in so many ways economically, not even to mention militarily. Germany has a $5 trillion economy versus 2 for Russia. There should be no competition here. But the problem is, when we went to command and staff, when we went to go to Water College, when we do all our advanced training, we always learn how to execute a war, full-throated, not half-assed, not going partial measures, and then drawing it out like we have every war since Korea, in my opinion. We did this with Iraq. We did it with Afghanistan. We continued to draw it out. We went half measures, and it went way too long, and I feel like we're doing the same thing here. Instead of just saying, all in, end this thing, within 1 year, it's over. That's Clausewitzian warfare. Now, of course, we take nukes off the table. I understand the deterrence there. But do you think we still, a year after we had our first conversation, a couple of years after we had our first conversation, do you still think that what I just said is viable and has application in this process to ending this war?
I do, sir. The role of assistance to Ukraine, the pace of assistance to Ukraine, the magnitude of it, has an outsized impact in this in this war.
Your narrative about the state of play with Ukraine right now, I mean, one aspect which I think sometimes gets overlooked a little bit in the U.S. is the fact that Ukraine has not just held the line in the Black Sea, it's actually pushed the Russian Navy to the furthest eastern end of the Black Sea. They've sank a third of the Black Sea fleet, including its flagship Moskva, sank a Kilo submarine in Sevastopol. And again, in terms of the state of play right now, we saw sea-launched missile attacks over the weekend by Russia, which actually has not happened much since Ukraine, without a navy, has been able to push back the Russian fleet. Can you comment again in terms of just how extraordinary, that achievement is without a navy, and also how whether or not the safe passage of grain shipments are now going to be at risk because Russia now seems to be sort of taking advantage of the lull?
Congressman, thanks for the opportunity to comment on one of the most amazing maritime feats in years. So you put your finger right on it. Not only did Ukraine roll back the presence of the Black Sea Fleet, they don't even have a navy. They have given us all a view of a future where unmanned surface vehicles, basically sea drones, have the potential to wage conflict at a large scale against a traditional manned navy. Really remarkable. They have had some help from us, from our European allies, but I should stress that a great deal of their expertise is indigenous. It's grown with their own engineers, their own lessons learned. It's remarkable. They did clear out a passage lane for safe passage of grain ships from Odessa down to the Turkish Straits, and that has been what has been securing the free passage of grain, the Black Sea grain initiatives, long defunct. So that's very encouraging. Russia did launch some surface launch cruise missiles the other day. They have been doing that. They have the capability to do that all the way from the Caspian, if you want to know the truth. So it's not unusual for them to do that. They don't have a very good ability to hit moving targets with those missiles, though. So I think there's a lot of space where we can help the Ukrainians here to continue to protect.
Great, thank you. I mean, and to Mr. Smith's point, the notion that, Ms. Thompson, the ceasefire is taking hold, the fact that, again, there were sea-launched attacks, maybe not on moving vessels, but they certainly hit cities in Ukraine over the weekend, that clearly shows that whatever holding the administration may think is happening, in fact, I would argue we're going in the reverse direction in terms of where we were before the negotiations in Riyadh. Mr. Chairman, there's an article in April 7th, just yesterday's Kyiv Post, headline, Russia mocks Trump ceasefire deal with sea-launched missile attack on Ukrainian cities. I ask that it be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. So, General Cavoli, you talked about the value of the alliance in terms of tracking on Russian submarine. Again, I represent Groton, Connecticut, which we have 15 attack subs that are sort of part of that team sport that our NATO allies do to protect the homeland. And General Guillot talked about that last week. Again, quickly before I'm done, could you maybe just again describe how the NATO anti-submarine warfare effort, which is a team sport, really is so important?
Yes, absolutely. I'll do it in generalities, Congressman, because so much of undersea warfare is held pretty closely by nations, to include ours, of course. Sub-hunting consists basically of submarine looking for submarine, maritime patrol aircraft using various means to look for submarines, and helicopters looking for submarines, and then surface vessels, usually destroyers or frigates, using their assets to look. And we combine all four of those dimensions to surge in specific areas that that our intelligence helps us to figure out. We don't have the world's monopoly on all that equipment. And it's very exquisite equipment. We don't have as much of it as we wished we have. Our allies do. Our Norwegian allies, our UK allies, the land space in Iceland where we based maritime patrol aircraft out of Keflavik, the refueling ships to keep our destroyers at sea, Danish frigates, all of this comes together and gets orchestrated.
Gentleman's time's expired.
Cavoli, I'm deeply concerned about the security situation in Eastern Europe with the ongoing invasion of Ukraine by war criminal Putin. I believe that if he has not stopped in Ukraine, he'll continue to turn his attention towards other former Soviet states like Moldova, or going next to the Baltic nations, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Will the U.S. maintain its presence in these countries to ensure that Russia is deterred from further aggression?
Sir, clearly that will be a policy decision that will be made as time goes on. We're in a good position right now.
Is it correct that the department's considering pulling out 2 rotational brigades out of Europe?
Sir, as I said earlier, there's a constant review of this all the time. Usually the dynamic is services are asking to recover some forces. They have readiness concerns, modernization concerns. So those discussions continue right now.
I think it'd be a grave mistake to pull forces out of Europe right now. I mean, this is the time to deter Russia, and I think withdrawing forces is a sign of weakness, and it lowers our deterrence. One more follow-up question with you, General Cavoli. While I agree with the administration that focusing on China as our top threat is essential, I worry that we must not take our eye off of Russia and Europe. I believe adamantly that Putin will take any sign of U.S. weakness in Europe as a chance to continue his campaign of aggression in the former Soviet territories. What is the overall U.S. military posture in Europe going forward?
The overall posture for the U.S. military will be to accomplish the objectives that we talked about a few minutes ago in my opening statement and in some of my responses to questions are, first and foremost, to defend the United States of America forward. Second, to arrange for and to support U.S. operations and other combatant commands and throughout Europe. And then, of course, to fight and deter as part of NATO, to deter Russia. So we participate in NATO's deterrent strategy. We're a vital part of that. I expect that to continue going forward.
Could you, in my last remaining seconds, just talk about the importance of the Baltic states? I'm the Baltic Security Caucus chairman, and they're right on the front lines.
Yeah, they are right on the front lines. They are absolutely one of the places that the Russian Federation has focused their attention on. Their preliminary attention, setting up a narrative of disputed territories and things like that, passport diplomacy with Russian language people, subversion campaigns and sabotage campaigns, all of those things. So they are certainly on the front line. They know it. They respond. They all spend over 2%. Estonia is over 3%. They've all devoted a huge fraction of their national power.
Gentleman's time's expired.
One of the things that you testified about is that this really is an industrial war and that we're behind in industry. Is that correct?
This is an industrial scale war, sir. It's using a lot of old-fashioned equipment that requires heavy industry. And when we look at our own ability, yeah, we need the ability to produce more weaponry more quickly.
And would you also agree that this is a technologically different conflict as well?
Yeah, it is, sir. There's a very interesting mix of legacy equipment and high tech. And it really seems that the side that's able to combine those two advantageously and then out-adapt the other side's countermeasures and countermeasures, that side gains the advantage for an enduring period.
Is it your understanding that 80% of the Russian soldiers who are being killed in the Ukrainian conflict are being killed by FPV drones?
Yes, I have seen those figures, sir. I think it's probably pretty hard for us to make sure we're accurate on those, given our ability to be there and count and everything. But it's certainly well over half, and it's certainly a large number, and it's a number that has increased steadily over the course of the conflict.
And I would say that these low-cost, high-impact systems are fundamentally rewriting the rules of the battlefield. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, the equipment, Congressman, that is software defined, where a greater part of its capability is defined by its software. Those are super easy and super inexpensive to modify and adapt. And so you can take a piece of hardware, and by manipulating the software, you can stay ahead of the enemy's countermeasures. It's a remarkable thing we're witnessing on both sides. The Ukrainians have proven especially adept at putting engineers down at the lowest level, observing what the soldiers do with the equipment, making modifications, and putting it right back in the fight. It's a big advance.
Thanks for that. And just generally, when I walk into this room, I don't walk into this room as a Republican. I hope my Democratic colleagues don't walk in here as Democrats. I know sometimes we all do, but I walk in here as an American. And I think however we feel about the Ukrainian conflict, particularly as a former special operator, that I think it would be unwise to not learn the lessons of this conflict. And one of the concerns that I have, particularly as we've talked about our defense industrial base being behind, the difference between high-cost, exquisite capabilities and low-cost, ubiquitous capabilities, and the capacity to actually build those capabilities. One of the concerns that I have, given the fact that 80% of Russian soldiers are being killed by FPV drones, is that we have little to non-existent capability in our country to produce these drones. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, we do have some capability, sir. I know a lot of people are working on it. I think as it goes to the U.S. military, I'd refer you respectfully to General George, the Chief of Staff of the Army, who's working very hard to distribute smaller drones at the lowest level and to proliferate them across formations. He's got a program that he calls Transformation in Contact, where he uses brigades that are deployed either into the Pacific or into Europe to accelerate his distribution and his deployment of these drones. I know that he needs some changes in the way funding works, but I'd leave it to him, sir, on that.
And I think I'm aware of these, but I think we're talking about, thousands quantity. And am I correct in saying Ukraine will produce approximately 4 million FPV drones this year?
Yeah, that's right, sir.
So we are very far behind that level of production capability for something that is achieving decisive impacts on today's battlefield.
Right. They are producing drones like most countries produce ammunition in massive quantities for expenditure.
Should we be doing the same thing in the United States of America?
I believe we should be doing that, and I believe we are increasingly going to be doing that. It's not my responsibility to speak about those programmatic, sir.
Thank you, General.
If war in Ukraine were to end today, do you believe that the Russian military would continue to represent a significant threat to the U.S., Ukraine, and our European allies in the coming years?
Yes, ma'am. It would take them a little bit of time to reorient their conventional force and reposition it, but not that much time, and then they could pose a conventional threat. Very important for me to add, however, that they have never stopped having their strategic capabilities, their nuclear submarines, their long-range aviation, their cyber, their space. All of that is alive and well and largely unaffected by the war in Ukraine.
Thank you. And if Russia was able to retain and control significant portions of Ukrainian territory once the war ends, do you believe Russia would consider that a victory and consider launching a similar invasion of Ukraine or another European country in the future?
It's hard for me to predict the future, ma'am, but I think it's very safe for all of us to say that wouldn't prevent them from doing it in the future. It would certainly leave the door open for them. Yeah.
Thank you. And as the Trump administration chooses to abandon Ukraine and let Russia rebuild its military, they're also considering cutting the U.S. military presence in Europe. So, General Cavoli, how would cutting U.S. forces from EUCOM impact your ability to respond to a crisis or potential conflict with Russia?
Ma'am, it would increase the amount of time it took to respond. It depends, of course, on what forces were hypothetically to be removed. It depends on what kind of action were required to counter Russia. But clearly, moving things to the other side of the Atlantic increases the time-space challenge. Other than that, I don't want to be evasive, but it's really a very situation-dependent question.
And would removing, I guess, to be more clear, our brigade combat team from Poland or having our forces stationed in Germany or Italy slow your response to a Russian assault on our Eastern European allies?
Yes, I've consistently testified to that.
Thank you. So as we move forward, can you just talk a little bit, too, as you mentioned, about what you think the key strategic aspects are of Russia's military?
So in the broadest sense, ma'am?
That provide the biggest threat to the United States?
Yeah, their nuclear arsenal.
What about their cyber capabilities?
I believe their nuclear arsenal poses a bigger threat. Mm-hmm. Their cyber capabilities are more likely to be used, but in most cases wouldn't have the catastrophic effect that the nuclear threat would have. But of course, that again depends on what nuclear weapons we're talking about, what cyber attacks. But in general, I would say the nuclear capabilities, and then I would say the space and cyber, sort of on a level. But conventionally, their strategic advantage continues to be mass, that they can put in direct proximity to NATO forces that challenges us to respond in time across the spaces required. So basically, they can put a force into place that would cause us to have to react in a timely fashion. And that time-space problem is really the essence of conventional deterrence on the continent.
And given the recent conflict in Ukraine, what has been what will be the hardest for Russia to rebuild in the aftermath of that?
I'd like to answer that in closed session because it goes into some technical stuff. What I can say is I don't think it's that hard to rebuild their mass. They have manpower available. They demonstrate the willingness to conscript it, and it doesn't take that long to reconstitute the size of their old force or even to increase it. They still have equipment and storage that they could pull out and renovate, and they have increased their ability to produce legacy hardware, tanks and armored personnel carriers and things like that. So there are some things that are easy. The things that are hard, it'd be better to answer in closed session, ma'am.
Thank you, and I yield back.
We continue to face historic times in the European theater. Russia's war in Ukraine, which is now in its 4th year, has revealed Russia to be a chronic threat, and in the coming years, it's going to be a growing threat, one that is willing to use military force to achieve geopolitical goals and is actively waging a campaign of destabilization across Europe and beyond. Further exacerbating this Russian threat are the deepening partnerships among our adversaries in Russia, Iran, the Chinese Communist Party, and the DPRK. These linkages increasingly pose a global risk. But U.S. EUCOM and the NATO alliance have risen to the challenge. NATO deterrence has held. War has not spilled into NATO territory. With support from a broad international coalition, U.S. EUCOM led the charge in helping Ukraine. We established Security Assistance Group Ukraine, which is now commanded by Lieutenant General Curtis Buzzard. And for 38 months of this war, SAGU has delivered critical munitions, arms, and equipment from the U.S. and our allies. These efforts have been indispensable in enabling the Ukrainian armed forces and have empowered them to mount a courageous defense. And now NATO has taken up this task. NATO has established in record time an organization to take over much of SAGU's mission. The threat of war also led the NATO alliance to embark upon an historic campaign to fundamentally overhaul and modernize its military capabilities. After years of underinvestment, too many years, our allies are finally optimizing the alliance for high-end warfighting. And within NATO, we now have the plans, the forces, the command and control, and we have the focus to meet that mission. And there's still much to do, but our allies are investing in defense at a rate we haven't seen since the Cold War, a 40% increase overall since February of 2022. So throughout this intense and challenging transformation of the alliance's warfighting structures, the presence of U.S. EUCOM forces has been essential to the alliance's modernization efforts. We've converged U.S. headquarters with NATO command structures, we've increased combined training and exercises, and we've been accelerating European modernization and readiness. So through U.S. leadership, we are laying the groundwork for European leadership, and thus for more years of peace and prosperity for the United States. There is a long road ahead. Sustained vigilance and pressure will be required. We have done all this to protect vital U.S. interest. Our strengthened allies will increase our strength, and our deep relationships with them give us the access, the basing, and the intelligence to defend our country forward. The first line of defense of our homeland begins in EUCOM, where our naval forces prevent Russian submarines from breaking out into the Atlantic and threatening the United States. The ballistic missile defense of Israel begins in EUCOM, from ships positioned in the eastern Mediterranean. And in EUCOM, it's our job safely to evacuate Americans from the Levant. We are America's force forward in the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is my last annual testimony to you as I'm closing 38 years of service. It's been the honor of a lifetime to serve with our brilliant members during these historic times, and I continue to be inspired by their commitment to our nation's forward defense. I thank you, our Congress, for your unwavering support of our servicemen and women, to their well-being, and your support to their mission. America is the greatest country in the world, and it is in large part because our armed forces are the greatest in the world. I look forward to your questions.
I thank both the witnesses. I recognize myself for questions. General Cavoli, given Russia's armed forces are mobilized for long-term confrontation, what's your best military advice on whether or not DoD should maintain the current force posture in Europe for the foreseeable future?
Chairman, it's my advice to maintain that force posture as it is now. We have reviewed periodically since in 2022, we originally surged forces forward. We have periodically reviewed the force structure at both the military level and the policy level. And I have consistently recommended throughout that period to maintain the forces we surged forward. And I would continue to do so now if asked, yeah.
Now, you referenced this in your opening statement. I would like you to reiterate it. How does the U.S. force posture in Europe contribute to the defense of our homeland as well as our operations in CENTCOM and AFRICOM?
Sir, thanks. Yeah, it's an important part of why we're there. First and foremost, Russian strategic forces. Russia continues to have very powerful strategic forces, thousands of nuclear weapons, and the delivery methods to deliver those. Those are not pointed just any place. Those are pointed, those are there, they exist for America. And our defense against those strategic forces, whether in the air or undersea, begins in the European continent. For example, Russian submarines are mainly stationed with the Northern Fleet up in Murmansk, up in the area east of the northern Nordic countries. They come out of their harbors and they go south between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, the famous GI-UK gap. We have to bottle them up north of that gap. If they break out into the Atlantic for a variety of reasons, it gets tougher to track them. And from those positions, they can hold the country at risk. So our maritime efforts, which are greatly aided by the efforts of our allies, their maritime patrol aircraft, their anti-submarine helicopters, their destroyers, all of our efforts together, but built around America's exquisite capabilities, that's the first line of defense against Russian subs. If we look to the south, we participated in the defense of Israel early this year. U.S. Central Command led a brilliant campaign with the Israelis and some other allies to protect against Iranian attacks against Israel. The ballistic missile defense part of that comes off of EUCOM ships in the Eastern Mediterranean. The refuelers come out of EUCOM. The airspace control comes out of EUCOM. We do the same for AFRICOM and everybody else. It's really because of our proximity and our familiarity with the area. The bases that we have in Europe and the legal permissions we have with nations hosting us give us the ability to project power quickly in our interest on behalf of our U.S. unilateral interests.
General Cavoli, you noted in your written statement and in that the inadequate U.S. defense production capacity and problems within foreign military sales systems are making it hard for Europe to buy U.S. weapons. What challenges does this pose to your command responsibilities in EUCOM?
Thank you, Chairman. In my oral statement, in my opening statement, I talked about an historic transformation of Allied command operations, the operational force in NATO. So we've designed these plans to defend NATO territory, and from that we derive a force structure requirement, a description of what exactly force is and how many of them we need. So this is sort of the spending list, the shopping list for defense spending in Europe now. Increasingly, nations are putting money up against that shopping list. 23 nations are spending above 2% right now. We're grateful for that, but there's got to be something in the store to buy. There is a lack of production capacity right now, and that's the first problem. The second problem is—
I'm sorry, my time's expired. I'm going to have to yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman.
But General Cavoli, can you tell us what's going on in the war in Ukraine right now? We seem to have forgotten those details. It is still ongoing. Russia is still attacking, but how is Ukraine doing in terms of holding off those attacks in the east primarily?
Sure, Congressman. Starting on the ground, if I could take just a moment and sketch down an imaginary map. If we look in the northeastern part of the battlefield up near the Russian province of Kursk, that's the northern extent of the front line of troops. As you know, late last summer, Ukraine pushed into Russia there and established a salient of several hundred square kilometers in a sort of surprise move. They've continued to hold that. The Russians vowed to kick them out by the end of last September. The Ukrainians are still there. There are still a certain number of brigades. I could go into the details.
Sure. But I guess in general, is it fair to— Russia has been throwing a lot of troops and taking a lot of casualties, particularly in the last month or two. Has that stalled across, you go from Kharkiv down to Kherson, basically the front, or are there places where Russia's making progress?
So Russia has stopped making progress in Kursk right now. They haven't been able to dislodge the Ukrainians. If we come all the way down the front along Chasiv Yar and the towns in Lugansk, if we go down to Pokrovsk in Donetsk, the Russians' attacks seem to have petered out. They've decreased in the last couple of weeks significantly in number, but the size and scope of the attacks seems to have petered out as well. The Ukrainians are in good positions. They're in good defensive positions. They've improved some of their readiness and manpower situation. They are indeed producing large numbers of Russian casualties. In a couple of minor places, the Ukrainians have actually gained some ground back, but I do not see the Ukrainians being in imminent danger of collapse. I do see the Russians struggling to make the kind of gains they were making last autumn.
General Cavoli, you mentioned in your presentation that war criminal Putin is on pace to replace all of the combat material that was damaged or lost throughout its invasion of Ukraine. What are the implications that this new supply of munitions and combat vehicles is helping Russia modernize its military?
That's exactly what it's doing, sir. It's helping to modernize their military. They have very extensive modernization plans and expansion plans. The Russians, about a year and a half ago, announced an intention to grow their armed forces to 1.5 million, up from 900,000, a significant increase to establish new commands, especially in the ground forces in northeastern part of Europe, that is on the border of NATO with Finland and the Baltics. They're on the path to doing that. They're not going very quickly because they're devoting so much to the effort in Ukraine. We'll see how much effort they'll be able to put into it after the war. It depends largely how the war ends. But that modernization program is intended to go right back and challenge NATO on the borders of NATO.
And indeed, for the United States, how important is it for us to produce conventional combat vehicles for future combat?
Oh, I believe combat vehicles and tanks maintain an important place on the battlefield, and our ability to produce them is going to have a lot to do with our ability to have a strong Army component to our joint force.
And General, I'm very encouraged that actually the Ukrainians have done so well in reducing the capabilities of war criminal Putin. When the dictator Bashar al-Assad of Syria was asking for assistance in November, it wasn't given, and he had to flee to Moscow. And so the people of Ukraine should be given credit that now there's a potential liberation for the people of Syria, and we already know the unintended consequence of what war criminal Putin did of having Finland and Sweden join NATO. So over and over again, it's so encouraging. A key point, too, is NATO countries and the EU provide more aid and have provided more aid than the United States. But thank goodness for President Trump that he's there to provide peace through strength. Thank you.
General Cavoli, we have nuclear weapons in Europe, do we not?
Yes, we do. The number and the modification of them is classified, but their existence is not.
It is important that the United States has those nuclear weapons there, correct?
Yes, they fall under my command and control for that purpose, sir, as the commander of EUCOM.
And so it is important that the United States have the position of Supreme Allied Commander because we have nuclear weapons in Europe.
Sir, if those nuclear weapons were going to be offered to the alliance for nuclear deterrence or for nuclear operations, that would come under the command of the Supreme Allied Commander. The way we're currently set up, I, as the commander of EUCOM, own the weapons, and I hand them to myself as the Supreme Allied Commander. That's possible because I am the same person and I am American.
So I really appreciate that you just did that straight line for everyone, because the idiocy of the fact that there was any discussion about the aspects of relinquishing the demand or even the rumor of relinquishing the demand is just beyond me, because you both indicated that we have nuclear weapons in Europe, that it's important we have nuclear weapons in Europe, and that it's important that you have the command because you are an American and they are under your command. So beyond all the other aspects of its importance, which is important, all of which are incredibly important to our national security, that alone ought to just end all of the debate. So thank you for making that with such unbelievable clarity. There have been individuals who have unbelievably also stated that they don't understand why we have bases in Germany to defend Germany. In your opening, you were describing that you don't go to work every day to defend Europe, that you're part of the overall arching aspects of the extended reach of the United States national and international security apparatus. Would you please give us some description, again, of the fact that the work that you do, that you're EUCOM, but you don't sit around every day and wait to see whether or not there's someone who's trying to invade Germany, that our bases in Germany actually, where there are Americans, are working every day on international security operations for the United States and on international security issues around the world?
Congressman, as the commander of U.S. European Command, I have U.S. missions. I take all of my instructions and my direction from the United States, from the Secretary of Defense, and I am there exclusively to pursue U.S. interest and to defend U.S. interest. Inasmuch as I'm located in Europe with that force, it's almost always in conjunction with allies, but I am doing it from a U.S. perspective for U.S. interest.
But you were describing Israel. You do things in the Middle East. You do things all around the world. You're not just sitting there defending Europe.
No, sir. If you look at the Mediterranean Sea, three very important U.S. combatant commands come together there. There's U.S. AFRICOM, Mike Langley. There's U.S. CENTCOM with Eric Kurilla, and there's EUCOM. And the intersection of the boundaries of those three organizations demands that we work together. In the event, EUCOM has the most bases and the most developed infrastructure to be able to support the other two. So obviously I spend more time supporting General Langley in Africa than he spends, supporting me in Europe. This is as a result of the infrastructure, the bases, the forces we have located there, and very importantly, the government-to-government agreements we have that permit us to use non-U.S. territory to stage our operations.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. That was very important, General. I appreciate that.
Or Cavoli, I'm sorry. General, last month the Defense Innovation Unit announced that EUCOM and INDOPACOM would be the first to receive new generative artificial intelligence capabilities under the Thunder Forge initiative for operational planning and decision support. From the command level perspective, how do you envision this technology enhancing EUCOM's capabilities?
Oh, it's going to be fantastic if it works out the way it's supposed to, Congressman. It's an ability to use artificial intelligence to do complex models and then to run scenarios in it. So effectively, to do the sort of wargaming that used to involve a bunch of majors hunkered over a map in the middle of the night, arguing back and forth, we'll be able to automate that and do thousands and thousands of iterations. It'll really help clarify some of our planning.
Okay. What kind of guardrails are you putting in place to ensure that it augments rather than replaces human judgment, especially in high stakes or escalatory scenarios?
Well, I expect my subordinate officers to come to me with the decisions and the recommendations, not the computer. It's going to be an integral part of our staff process of the way we do them now. It could conceivably help to replace some manpower, but in the beginning, it's designed to enable manpower.
Okay, and General Cavoli, I appreciate you raising the alarm about the roughly dozen European ports near or co-located with logistic hubs that have significant Chinese investments. I think this is a critical issue that doesn't get the attention it deserves in Washington. What's your assessment of the risk this poses in a crisis? And when you bring these concerns directly to our allies, are they receptive to your concerns?
The concerns are obvious, sir. We could lose access at a critical time to a port. In our exercise program, we're very careful and very deliberate to exercise a wide variety of different port facilities so that we understand the way they work and their ownership and everything, and so that we exercise our rights to use them. When we talk to our allies about them, they almost always immediately respond if we have concerns about the ownership. In some cases that we could talk about in closed session, allied governments have intervened and stopped a tender because it was going to put a critical piece of infrastructure potentially into the wrong hands.
Mm-hmm. And you also pointed to CCP-linked 5G infrastructure across parts of Europe as an area of concern. Beyond diplomacy, what tools do we have, either bilaterally or through NATO, to mitigate the surveillance and influence risks this poses?
Beyond diplomacy, sir, I think I'd do best to answer that in closed session.
Yes, sir. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes a gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Russia has launched 1,460 guided aerial bombs, 670 attack drones, and more than 30 missiles in the last week, killing at least 21 civilians, including 9 children. Ms. Thompson.
Since President Trump assumed office in January of this year, have our European allies and partners increased their defense spending or shown actionable plans to do so?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. General Cavoli, can you please provide some examples of how they've done that?
Spain today announced that they're going up to 2.3% of GDP. That's a big lift in Spain, where defense spending was not very favored for a long time, and where there was, for a very long time, a very weak coalition government. That's just today's example, Congressman. We could go on and on. The Denmark has recently announced plans to go to 3.2% of GDP. And to spend 2 additional billion euros on Arctic security. Those are just 2 examples in the past couple of days, weeks.
Thank you. Would the strides these allies are making be sufficient enough to meet the implementation requirements of their regional plans under NATO?
Not yet. They will be. So there's a long process called the NATO defense planning process, Congressman. That's where we take the force structure requirement of the plans and assign it out to nations to build for. That's been concluded. All nations have accepted all their capabilities targets. Now it's time to build, and this is where we come to the question of industrial capacity.
Certainly, and I remember you guys mentioned that capacity, we've got to have something to buy. And that's something that this committee and our chairman fully supports, and we've had many discussions on that. Let's see, General Cavoli, we've already touched on this, but if you could clarify, some of our allies on NATO's eastern flank have demonstrated their commitment to President Trump's call to increase their GDP spending on defense and improve capabilities, including Poland and the Baltic states. Poland itself has increased its interest in American defense products. Do you believe the current FMS system in the Pentagon operates efficiently enough to ensure that U.S. defense equipment reaches foreign buyers on time?
No, sir. We have a lot of work to do in that regard.
General Cavoli, one last thing. Last week, Defense News published an article highlighting President Putin's announcement of the new Perm nuclear submarine of the Yasin M class. The article also highlighted some of the issues being faced by the Russian industrial base, not unlike our own. General Cavoli, can you provide a brief overview of the current state of the Russian undersea capability in your area of responsibility?
Could I do that in closed session, please?
Sure.
Thanks.
And then, if you could, just maybe closed session as well, but how does the United States compare to Russia in terms of its undersea capabilities?
I am very confident in the United States Navy, sir, but we can go into details in closed session.
I appreciate your testimony today, and I yield back.
General Cavoli, from a military standpoint, what is the impact on our operations and partnerships when our allies hear American leaders suggest that the EU was formed to screw us, or to entertain ideas of invading an ally's territory, or for calling them free riders when they are contributing a lot to supporting our troops? How does this affect trust and cohesion among our allies that we depend on for our collective security?
Ma'am, thanks for the question. Clearly, it strays well out of my lane, but I talk to all of the chiefs of defense in Europe all the time, and our military-to-military relationships remain quite strong and are very solid, ma'am.
Have President Trump's comments come up in any of your conversations with other military leaders?
Rarely.
But have they, in the context of Europe, in this being formed to screw them, or what the president is trying to do in Greenland?
Ma'am, it's rare enough that I'm searching to be sure to give you a complete and honest answer. I can't remember an instance of that off the top of my head. You know, military guys, we really try to stay carefully to the military construct and to the military lane because it's not our job in any of the nations in NATO. So I can't think of an example off the top of my head. If I do think of one, I'll be sure to tell you.
The Aegis air defense functionality in Europe is not activated due to regional political concerns. Given the willingness of Russia to deploy novel hypersonic weapons in Ukraine, is it your best military advice that we activate these air defense capabilities to counter that threat?
Sir, I have, as the Supreme Allied Commander, made that recommendation to the North Atlantic Council.
Thank you. Also, can you explain how the missile defense architecture that we've invested in Europe could protect the U.S. homeland?
Oh, sure. So, some of the radars involved provide some of the very first warnings, and there's quite a bit more, but I think I'd be more comfortable discussing it in a closed session, sir.
Fair enough. Okay. Given the U.S. increase of the drone threats to critical infrastructure military bases in Europe, how is EUCOM planning to integrate directed energy technologies into its counter-drone defense?
First of all, we're eager to do that, Congressman, because a lot of the other kinetic solutions are pretty problematic to use, in congested areas and bases that are in congested areas. We're planning to use a layered defense and a full suite of different capabilities. Some of them electromagnetic interference, some of them directed energy, as you said, some of them just kinetic projectiles. It's important to remember that we've got to do that in close connection to civil authorities from the host nation. And each nation has different regulations for spectrum management, for the release of weapons and things like that. So we work through this daily. It's a pretty big initiative.
Would that be a more cost-effective counter measure to some of the million-dollar missiles that we use to shoot down?
DE? Yes, sir. Yeah. I mean, I think everybody's looking for that new way to shoot down aerial objects that doesn't require us to launch multi-million-dollar missiles at a $1,000 drone type of thing.
Yeah. Very good. In my district in southwest Indiana, General Cavoli, the Crane Army Ammunition Activity Mission, where nearly 25% of the DoD's conventional munitions are stored. A large amount of the equipment and munitions stored there has been withdrawn via the Presidential Drawdown Authority and sent to Ukraine. How important is it from a combat commander's perspective that we modernize and restock these munitions storage facilities?
Our stockage levels are extremely important to a combatant commander, sir, and to the extent that they're depleted by operations or by donations to another country such as Ukraine, they need to be replenished. There is a program to do that, well funded previously by the Congress, and it's an important thing for us to consider.
Okay, thank you. Also, General Cavelli, spectrum is a valuable finite resource that's used by the DoD. There are some in Congress who want to require the DoD to vacate its spectrum allocations. Could you speak to what the impact would be on EUCOM if the DoD was forced to vacate the spectrum allocations, and what would be the effects on missile defense?
Yes, sir. So I think most of the discussion is around the S-band, and we use that. I could go in a little bit more detail in classified session, although I'm not exactly an electrical engineer, but I could talk to you more about it in classified session. It would affect missile defense and air defense.
That would affect the potential for defending our country in Europe and the continental U.S. as well. Okay,
that's right.
Yep.
In the initial stages of the war, the Ukrainians were able to destroy a very large percentage of the conventional land forces of Russia. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
Over half by most estimations.
Right, would have to think of it as a rolling figure because they were growing at the same time as they were losing. But yeah, those are about the kind of numbers. We're looking at about almost 4,000 tanks, Russian tanks, destroyed by Ukraine in this country.
But since that time, Russia has, with surprising speed, been able to recapitalize and rebuild both its industrial base, but also its conventional forces, and replace a lot of that equipment and personnel. Is that accurate?
Absolutely.
And how would you characterize China's involvement in that recapitalization, both the industrial component as well as the military component?
We could talk a lot more about this in closed session, sir, and perhaps we'll have the opportunity to. But there has been contributions. Some of them have been indirect. By absorbing much of Russian-sanctioned oil exports and gas exports, they have been able to continue to provide funds that have enabled Russia to continue to build their military. Some have been more direct. Some have been through commercial ventures that may or may not be supported by the Chinese Communist Party. And beyond that, I think I'd be safest to talk to you about it in closed session, sir.
So, and we'll convene in closed session, but both directly and indirectly, economically and to some degree militarily, China has chosen sides here?
Oh, certainly. I think there's an important side note, Congressman. Sometimes I've been asked, well, they're only giving them moral support, and I typically respond, but that's the most pernicious type of support.
But it's more than moral support, would you say?
And it is.
Yes. Okay. So they have determined that it's in their interest to support Russia in this conflict.
It would appear so.
Can you provide an update of the role that on-orbit warfare is playing in your theater?
Sure, Congressman, with the caveat that I think, as you know, it's really hard to talk about space operations and capabilities in open session.
Sure.
So if you'd like to talk about it a little bit more in closed session, we could. I would also refer you to General Whiting and to General Saltzman, who are genuine experts in this question. I'm a customer. I'm a consumer of their efforts. Yes, our space capabilities are absolutely essential to the way we do operations. Our adversary space capabilities are absolutely essential to the way they do operations, and they understand how important space is to us. So it is very much a contested environment, a contested capability, and I'd be delighted to talk more about it in a closed session, sir.
In your opinion, are Russia and China's space-based capabilities stronger, weaker, or the same compared to the start of the war in Ukraine?
They grow constantly. They are both working very hard to improve their capabilities and to expand their capacity, and they have been doing that with the war in Ukraine, and I imagine they would have without the war in Ukraine as well.
Okay, and then finally, in your testimony, you highlighted how EUCOM partners with Cyber Command to, quote, deter advanced persistent threats, unquote. Can you describe where those threats come from and what they're targeting?
Yeah, there are non-governmental threats, sir, right? Criminal activity, ransomware, and things like that, that have national security implications, and so they matter to us. We help our allies with defending against those. There are also state-based threats, and each one of our main adversaries, that group of 4 that I named in my opening statement, each one of those is quite active in the cybersphere.
How can Congress help strengthen your hand in those fights?
Sir, by supporting U.S. Cyber Command. All of their subordinate organizations have relationships with the combatant commands. 16th U.S. Air Force is my cyber component for EUCOM. That makes a big difference when you support Cyber Command. Also when you support the National Security Agency, because that work is so closely tied to cyber work.
You speak a little bit about, given your unique view into that role, how would Russia and Putin specifically view us backing away from that role?
Thanks, Congressman. First of all, thanks for pointing out the role General Eisenhower had as the first SAC year. You might imagine his likeness, his photographs, busts of him are all over the headquarters. There's one sitting behind my desk that looks over my shoulder, checking my homework every day. So if you want to feel a little bit of pressure ever, just take a job that Ike had. Big shoes to fill, indeed. Yeah, everybody relies on SAC here. Our allies want American leadership. Our allies would like to have an American as SAC here. From our perspective, we gain quite a bit of influence from it, right? I have a very loud voice inside Europe as a result of my position, and I think those are to our advantage. Of course, what the United States decides to do is always going to be a policy matter, and there are other considerations that our civilian leaders will take into consideration as they think about these things. What do the Russians see? You know, I think that of all the nations in the alliance, the Russians have the most respect for the strength of the U.S. military. They respect all the militaries, and especially the collective military, but we are the military that stands out as something for them to worry about. And so an officer who has the ability to command U.S. forces probably is a bigger problem for them than not.
I can only imagine, truly, what General and former President Eisenhower would think about us even considering walking away from that position. I think it's embarrassing and pathetic.
Now is at the same time, China threatens our momentum by trying to purchase some of the most advanced machines that are coming out of the Netherlands that are capable of producing these chips. Now, how does Chinese infiltration of European supply chains threaten our security here at home?
Congressman, it's a great question, and I think you bring up a very important dynamic, and this is something that we do continue to encourage our European allies to focus on, which is the economic security considerations, particularly as we look to strengthen the transatlantic industrial base on both sides of the Atlantic. This is a major consideration that would affect our ability to co-produce, co-develop, et cetera, with our European allies, and we want to be able to do that, but those conditions certainly on the front on China do impact our ability to do that, and so it's a consideration that we will continue to raise with them and encourage them to address so that we can develop together.
And General, thank you for your lifelong service, and I know it's going to continue afterwards, especially when you become a veteran, but I appreciate all of what you've done to our country. And my question to you is regarding Europe, is Europe doing enough to control or to help the situation contain what's going on with the Houthis in Yemen?
So the EU has a mission called Aspides, which has ships in the Gulf to protect commercial shipping, sir. Obviously, the United States has felt the need to do the same alongside it. Together, it's hard for me to say if it's enough. I'd refer to General Kurilla, who follows that much more closely.
Sure. But we also know that the Russians have been helping the Houthis as well. Is that correct?
I'd like to answer that in closed session, please, sir.
No worries. And how much of the Iranian, Houthi, and Chinese threats to Europe, how much can that affect the United States?
I guess indirectly, it massively, directly. Probably we don't have that much shipping, I don't think, that comes through the Suez. However, our warships transit that all the time, so it would affect our ability to conduct military operations for sure. I'm not sure. I'm not an economist. I couldn't comment on how big the impact would be on us economically or something.
And previously, we talked about how the U.S. territories in the Pacific will seek their protection with Article 5. But that's not the case and would not. But however, Article 4 gives the authority for consultation and non-obligated support. Just want to know on your what the situation now we have with Yukon situation, our strategic situation. Are our allies, sir, still willing to support us in the Pacific? And with your experience through this situation, how can we better coordinate with your partners on security cooperation and international organizations and regional security in Pacific and Asia? General?
Thanks, Congressman. First, thanks for your kind words about our servicemen. So many of our European allies have direct security interests in the Indo-Pacific. France has possessions there, the UK, so they have direct interest, and they do have military presences abroad there to help those up. They also do stage exercises in order to make sure they maintain the defense of their territories. They also work very closely with the Department of Defense and with U.S. Indo-PACOM to coordinate occasional presence. A UK aircraft carrier is about to start a global mission. They are going to go through the Indo-Pacific. They are going to do so in close coordination with Admiral Paparo. So this gives us additional capacity out there as they come and go, and they continue to do that. However, the alliance is focused on the defense of the alliance territory as defined, as you pointed out, in Article 6. That does not prevent them from operating outside my AOR. SACEUR's AOR does not include the United States, but the only time the alliance has declared Article 5 in its history was the morning after 9/11, when they declared that it was an attack on all of us and sent NATO AWACS planes to help our Operation Noble Eagle to defend our skies in the aftermath of those 2001 terrorist attacks.
Thank you, General. And also with the expansion of the ballistic missile system we have in Yukon, I'm wondering, especially with the Aegis Ashore and the sites in Romania and Poland, the Golden Dome that we're looking at, what is this experience and these lessons learned that we can reflect to help us in the Indo-PACOM area?
So at an unclassified level, we were able to collect an awful lot of information about adversary rockets and missiles during the course of the conflict in Ukraine. A lot of that is given to us by our Ukrainian colleagues. You know, we gave them radars to defend themselves. They give us back invaluable data that we're able to study. So that's only one example, sir.
Thank you, General. Ms. Thompson, just one quickly. We just got a few seconds. Appreciate what SecDef is doing. And he went to UCOM for a specific reason. Where did he go next?
I believe he went to the Indo-Pacific.
That's right. I got to visit him there. Who was the last SecDef that came to the Indo-Pacific to Guam before our current Secretary of Defense?
I actually don't know off the top of my head, but I know it has to have been 10 years at least.
At least. It was Rumsfeld.
Oh, that's right.
I'm glad the interest of the United States for our Secretary of Defense is going from not just from the West Coast to the East Coast, but from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
What is the possible threat of later on, if the Russians are successful in Ukraine, that they will continue their aggression on other former Soviet states?
Thank you, sir. So we help them in a variety of ways. First, how does NATO help them? NATO's new defense plans give a structure for them to plan and to nest their national defense plans inside. So those plans go together with the NATO plans, and this really helps a defense planner clarify a whole bunch of things about how much of what he needs where, et cetera, et cetera. Second, the command structures that have been outlined and the relationships that have been outlined as a result of the plans or inside the plans gives them permanent relationships for units to build readiness with and headquarters to build procedures with. So that's one big advantage that helps them a great deal. Bilaterally, we work very closely with those allies because they're so intent on buying American stuff. So it's one thing to buy a HIMARS. It's another thing to know how to use it. That's pretty simple. But it's another thing entirely to know how to integrate that capability into your warfighting methodology. And so, for example, I've got a battery of HIMARS, American HIMARS, in Estonia that's been working for well over a year and a half with them on how exactly they're going to incorporate their long-range fires into their operational methodology after this. I just was on the phone with I just received a letter from the Chief of Defense of Lithuania, who's interested in having a similar program, some sort of a HIMARS Academy. I could go on and on. On a third level, we also do special security assistance initiatives. So there's the Baltic Air and Missile Defense Initiative. There's the Baltic State Security Initiative. And those are focused appropriations for us to be able to help them buy the American stuff that matters to us. Focused on air and missile defense and domain awareness in the air right now, of course, because that's the most important thing. I guess I could go for hours. There's some classified things we do as well, Congressman.
All right. Ms. Thompson, can we still be confident that we're going to keep troops in Europe there and keep supporting NATO, that the United States will step up if, in fact, Russia does invade the Baltic states?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. On the first piece, I would just emphasize again, we're in the midst of a global posture review, so certainly we're taking these priorities and these considerations into our analysis as we conduct that. And then I would also emphasize the Secretary was very clear that we remain committed to NATO, and that includes all facets of the treaty. And so I would say yes. And I would also just add perhaps a bit of color to what General Cavoli was talking about specifically with the Baltics, and just emphasize that we have been so appreciative in this administration so far of how our Baltic friends friends acutely understand the threat perception, and we hope that, and we have encouraged our Baltic friends to communicate that threat perception to the Western and Central European powers, as well as we try to encourage the alliance as a whole to focus on defense spending.
All right, and then I got 30 seconds, but so very quickly, General Cavalli, you and your counterparts, INDOPACOM, AFRICOM, are always, I don't want to say at odds, but always fighting for assets to kind of come into your areas of your command and areas of operation there, responsibility. How are we kind of working through that to get to this point there, to kind of make sure that we're not asking for too much, but you're getting what you need?
Sure. So our job is to articulate our requirements based on the task we're given, sir, and the Secretary of Defense, with the advice of the chairman, allocates the resources. There's another step, though, right? Eric Kirill and I have known each other our whole lives. We can communicate. There are things that I can do to help alleviate some of his challenges and vice versa. Mike Langley's headquarters is right next door to my headquarters in Stuttgart. We talk back and forth. And
gentleman's time's expired.
The level of importance, the nature of importance of continuing to have a heavy ground presence on the European continent in terms of our security planning going forward, whether it's armor, infantry, or otherwise.
Sure, sir. So the alliance, we collectively require a heavy ground presence. That is specifically to be able to overcome that singular Russian advantage of being able to put its forces on our borders as an alliance before the initiation of hostilities. That causes a time-space problem for us in terms of reinforcing. So the positioning of this large force has to be appropriate to the situation, right, to the level of threat. Whether that ground force comes from America or someplace else is really, SACEUR doesn't care as long as it functions. There are some capabilities that the U.S. is very careful to make sure we continue to contribute because they're exquisite and in some cases unique, and we understand that, and those will have to be there all the time otherwise. So the question is, what is the preponderance of U.S. versus other nations' heavy ground force that is committed? That's something we balance all the time, and that's something that will change as our European allies pick up the capabilities targets we've just assigned them in the NATO defense planning process and commit the money that they've devoted in a profitable and a productive acquisition program to get the stuff they need.
Thank you, General. And at risk of sounding like I'm reading from the history books, I'm old enough to remember Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, and if my memory is correct, it was our ability to rapidly move the 7th Corps from Europe to the Middle East that allowed us to launch Desert Storm with the rapidity that we did. Can you speak a little bit, your point about whether there are American heavy ground forces or European allies in Europe, how does having American heavy ground forces pre-deployed in the European theater affect our planning and our ability to respond to American interests in the Middle East or in other proximate areas outside of Europe immediately?
It's fundamental to it, sir. There are three principal components of it's important to us: access, basing, and overflight. So our ability to base our forces someplace and to have the ability to access those forces to deploy them, and then to have the agreements to overfly nations. All of those things happen. They're usually based on pretty deep relationships. If you want it to be there when you need it, it's got to be, you have to have prepared for that moment. So those three things, access, basing, and overflight, are really a shorthand way of saying that gives us the ability to put forces forward in readiness, waiting to be deployed. Now, to what extent do we need to do that? That's largely a policy question, but that is the strictly military advantage of having forces forward for our own purposes. We do deploy them all the time. We've been, leaning toward and then backing off of non-combatant evacuation operations throughout the Mediterranean area for a couple of years. We provide forces on short notice to General Kurilla to be able to use in Central Command. I could go on, but I think I hope I've answered your question.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair.
We don't agree always in Congress. We often disagree these days. But one thing I want to say at the outset is we've heard a lot of noise, but we've actually heard a lot of agreement in this hearing from across this dais. Agreement on basic principles and commitments that I think are worth reiterating because people from Warsaw to the Kremlin should hear it loud and clear. Does the United States of America have a national security interest, General, in the survival and the strength of the NATO alliance?
I believe it does.
And Ms. Thompson?
Yes, ma'am.
And what about the survival and strength of our European allies, including Ukraine?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. I think it's important that we reiterate these basic principles. And General, could you elaborate on what is the nature of that national security interest that we have in the NATO alliance and in the survival and strength of Ukraine?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. So a lot of the interests are a lot of the benefits are rooted in common interests, common values, common histories, things like that. I'm not going to go into those just because that's subjective, debatable, and people have different opinions on it. As a military matter, some of the most advanced militaries in the world are in the NATO alliance. And some of the militaries in the world that we can be surest will work with us and are militarily interoperable with our forces are in the NATO alliance. It's surprising when you go outside of Europe how much the absence of something like NATO, the structures, the interoperability, is noticed immediately.
Thank you, General. This may be more for a closed setting, but you shared with us in your written testimony and several times today that Russia's war in Ukraine is the most visible sign of Moscow's great power ambitions. So I want to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about how you think about Vladimir Putin's ambitions. What would satisfy Vladimir Putin? Would taking the eastern half of Ukraine satisfy his ambitions, or would it embolden him?
Well, I think if we go back and look at the history of his tenure as the president of Russia, you can follow his ambitions. They're pretty consistent, but they expand. Clearly, he's not yet been satisfied with the amount of Ukraine that he's taken over because he's continuing to try to fight forward. How the conflict ends, may disprove that. We don't know yet, but he certainly is interested in controlling the nations that are in his immediate neighborhood by whatever means necessary. And we've seen that demonstrated consistently over time. Could he stop tomorrow? We don't know.
General, you testified to the importance of our intelligence cooperation with our European allies and with Ukraine. You said that our ability to gather intelligence is enabled by enduring relationships that cannot develop episodically and that must be sustained. Can you, as someone who comes from the intelligence world, thank you for recognizing the important role that our intelligence cooperation plays. Is pausing our intelligence cooperation with European allies a good thing for America's national security?
No, we want continuous sharing of intelligence. We normally do it, as you know, ma'am, on a bilateral basis. We have very strong agreements with the nations in the alliance about bilateral intel sharing, and we're very grateful for it.
Was the pause last month in our intelligence cooperation and sharing with Ukraine helpful or harmful to America's interests in your area of operation, in your region?
That one I have to answer in closed session, ma'am, because I just have to answer that one in closed session.
Thank you, General.
Briefly expand on the importance of that particular allyship with Denmark.
Sure. Yeah. Denmark, ma'am, is one of our strongest allies. The bilateral relationship, from the Danish perspective, is far and away their most important bilateral security relationship. I've known the Prime Minister of Denmark for quite a while, and she would initiate any conversation with that comment. They have been very reliable allies. They've got a high-tech military, not a big one, but it's high-tech. They have extremely competent special forces and naval special forces, and they contribute those liberally to the operations under my command as the Supreme Allied Commander. So, yeah, very strong ally. We love all our allies, but I would say that Denmark's a very strong one.
You don't have favorites, but I appreciate that. Ms. Thompson, reflecting on that, wouldn't you agree that the president's threats to possibly utilize military force to seize Greenland, a territory of Denmark, could only threaten that key allyship and, again, our shared ability to address the threats, particularly from Russia in the Arctic?
Thank you, Congresswoman. What I would say is I would focus on the bilateral relationship piece that General Cavoli hit on. I think that there's a lot of cooperation here, including on Greenland, in particular on the landmass. Particularly, we already have space capabilities there, and I think that there's opportunities. And the Secretary, in his pull aside with the Danish Minister of Defense, had a really positive conversation about where we could take the bilateral defense relationship. So I think there's room for growth and positivity there.
Okay. General, you've shared that Russia poses a chronic and growing threat, and that they are focused on a, quote, campaign of destabilization across your command. You also spoke about the intersection of how you work with the other combatant commands, particularly around the Mediterranean. I want to switch our conversation to yet another domain, that being of cyber. And can you help us better understand the cyber wars that Russia is waging against Ukraine, our allies in NATO, your command in Europe? And can you speak to your collaboration with Cyber Command, which is headquartered just a stone's throw from my district?
Yes, ma'am. I think the simplest way to get at this question is to describe roughly the two buckets in which we can consider Russian cyber operations to fall, right? Some of them are about the content. It's information operations, it's influence operations, it's the campaigns to spread their version of information around Europe and the world. Those are very, very active. Those don't necessarily involve cyber work, but can be injected through cyber vectors. But it can be as simple as a television channel. On the other hand, there's also the technical cyber work that they do, which is designed to penetrate our networks, to get into systems, to produce effects. Sometimes it's to take information, and sometimes it's to leave us problems. And they do a lot. I depend very, very heavily on U.S. Cyber Command through 16th Air Force in order to be able to combat those things and to help our allies combat them.
What measure is EUCOM taking to address potential strains in defense collaboration and ensure joint operational effectiveness?
So we continue with our exercise programs. We continue with our consultations with our allies. We continue to work very closely. EUCOM continues to work very closely with NATO, with the Allied Command operations, and we move forward just in a straight military fashion, sir.
And as European nations aim to enhance their defense industries and reduce dependency on U.S. arms, how does EUCOM assess the potential impact on NATO's collective defense posture?
Well, first, we need our allies to rearm in general. If they rearm with stuff, we want them to rearm with equipment that works with ours. In many cases, the easiest way to do that is to buy U.S. So during the course of this conflict, Congressman, the orders, the value of foreign military sales orders, that is our allies' orders to buy American equipment, have increased by 600%. There right now are 4,000 sales cases worth $265 billion that European nations are lined up to buy from the United States as arms manufacturers. As the Allied commander, I encourage that, right? I want more capability and capacity as fast as we can get it.
Have you seen any impacts of the recent tariffs impacting the 600% increase in those sales?
Sir, I have not. I have been here for the last week and a half testifying to the Senate and now here.
The deepening strategic partnership among China, Russia, Iran, North Korea pose an increasing challenge for the United States and its allies in Europe. I'm particularly concerned by Russian and Chinese economic and military partnership causing strain on individual European countries within the NATO alliance. General, how is EUCOM working with European partners to deter or expose CCP efforts to fragment NATO cohesion through strategic investments?
Sure, sir. The first way is through intel sharing, right? We have a number of different, we have many bilateral intel channels, but we also have a few lesser known multilateral intel sharing fora. And in those, we talk about these things. The Department of Defense, EUCOM, also works closely with our State Department colleagues in missions throughout the alliance because they really have the lead in helping our allies avoid malign Chinese investments. Finally, as I mentioned to a member earlier, our exercise program specifically uses infrastructure that we want to be sure of the reliability of. So we vary what we do and where we do it so that we're always testing the reliability of our infrastructure. And when we find a problem, we talk to our host nation about it right away.
While our European allies have been working to increase their defense spending to meet the 2% NATO defense spending target, the administration's recent decision to impose tariffs on nearly every NATO country and allied partner could undermine these efforts and potentially slow our collective progress. General Cavoli, how do you foresee these tariffs impacting the defense spending of our European allies?
You know, I don't know, Congressman. Sir, in an economic sense, I'm not an economist, so I can't walk through the trail of how it'll work. I do know that our allies are determined to increase their defense capability and capacity, no matter where they buy things from or no matter how they get it. That is nearly a universal sentiment in the alliance right now. And to spend more than 2% as you go around, you hear a lot of that.
And are these countries now less likely to meet the 2% target due to these tariffs? And will this hurt our European allies, including the Baltic states, who outspend the U.S. As a percentage of GDP?
Sir, if they're unable to access our market or if they have to pay more than expected for equipment, certainly that's going to affect how much capacity they can build, how quickly. I don't know how the tariffs will exactly do that, though.
In the past 6 months, Russian and Chinese ships have been implicated in sabotaging undersea cables. This comes as no surprise given Russia's ongoing efforts to target Ukrainian power cables, telecom links, and gas pipelines since its invasion of Ukraine in 2022. General, how is European Command addressing the threat of sabotage or disruption of undersea cables in European waters, and what steps are being taken to mitigate the risks posed by state actors, particularly Russia and China?
So European Command, sir, first, as with some of the other responses, shares intelligence when we get intelligence on this to support our allies as they defend their own infrastructure. We also defend our own U.S. critical infrastructure that's overseas. Interestingly, the biggest collective defenses of critical national infrastructure don't involve the U.S. hardly at all. So last year, I started an operation called Baltic Sentry, where we brought together under NATO command voluntarily donated ships and crews, as well as coastal defense radars from the Baltic allies, the allies in the Baltics and the Nordics, and we sewed those together into a single operation that surveils and increases our understanding of what's going on the surface and below the surface of the Baltic Sea. For the longest time, there were no U.S. ships involved in that. There are no U.S. ships involved in it today. I think I have 40 Marines who temporarily helped with a couple of radars, and I think they may have departed already. So this is an example of our allies taking that upon themselves as they should, and happily.
And if I could get one more question in general, can you discuss the implications if the administration withdraws U.S. troops from Syria? How might this affect our counterterrorism efforts in the Eastern Mediterranean?
So it would mainly, from my perspective, affect our ability to collect intelligence. And I have to leave that at that in open session, sir. I concern myself very much with the Russian presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. That has been greatly weakened.
Gentleman's time's expired. You're not
reality of our alliances and partnership in Europe. General Cavoli, in the years since Putin's unprovoked invasion, I've been heartened to see that former Soviet states who had previously been deferential to Russia were beginning to push back on Putin's bullying tactics. Obviously, the U.S. posture towards Ukraine has changed a great deal in the last 3 months. In your opinion, how would a U.S. withdrawal from global leadership in support of Ukraine impact these smaller nations' ability to demonstrate independence from Russia? Specifically, in your opinion, will it have an impact on the democracy movement in Belarus?
Congressman, it's a great and important question. A lot of answering it would go well outside of my my wheelhouse. I will say that all nations are watching very closely what the U.S. does any place all the time. We're such a mover on the global stage that everybody's constantly observing and calculating against that. That's especially true in those states that have the opportunity to get out from under Russia's shadow. Armenia would be an excellent example of that. So they're watching closely.
Thank you, sir. On a similar note, I wanted to ask you about the following subject. So Putin's regime is constantly engaged in egregious cybercrime and offensive cyber operations against us, our allies, against companies, infrastructure, you name it, which is why I was very distressed to hear that this administration initiated a pause on offensive cyber operations against Russia. I'm honestly at a loss to understand how giving Putin's cyber criminals a free pass serves our national security or economic interests. General, does a cessation of offensive cyber operations, either temporarily or ongoingly against Russia, create any risk for our troops and operations in Europe?
Sir, any details would have to be spoken about in closed session, of course. The cessation that you're talking about did not pose risk to my troops. If they had, I would have made that clear immediately.
Thank you, sir. I just want to say on behalf of Congress and the nation, we're so grateful for your service, and you are what makes America great. So thank you so much.
Ukraine, I'd just like to chat with you about Ukraine. And if you could, for America and for some members of this committee that need clarity, could you describe from your perspective, which is quite unique and experienced, what does victory look like? Can you share with us how you would envision victory? Should we continue to invest American treasure in to seek some resolution of the Ukrainian war and Russian invasion of Ukraine? Clearly, we seek some definition of victory. Could you possibly share that?
Absolutely, Congressman. And without getting into the realm of policy, which Ms. Thompson is obviously much better prepared to talk about than I think you have to start by saying victory for whom, right? And whose victory? What does a good outcome for the United States look like is one part of that.
Okay.
What does a good outcome for Ukraine look like? When you think about Ukraine, you can think about it in increments. The first step to winning is not losing, right? So Ukraine has to defeat Russia's efforts to continue to take their territory. Then after that, you have a national question: how much of it do we want to take back, and what is the cost-benefit analysis of what it will take to take that back? And I think the Ukrainians calculate that every day and plan against that every day. So it's a complicated question, but I think an important part of it is we have to ask ourselves, what are the benefits for us in the various outcomes
from the Soviet Union to the present.
General Cavoli, how many troops do we need in Europe to deter Russia at its current end strength?
Sir, our current capacity is deterring Russia right now. Of course, the answer to that question always depends on where Russia goes in the future, right? How do they configure themselves? Where do they place themselves? What are their intentions? For what we're doing right now, it's obviously working, but they're quite occupied elsewhere. I would point out, I wouldn't measure it also strictly by end strength, the numbers of human beings. It really comes down to what capabilities are we able to bring to bear, how quickly, and how does that nest in to the alliance's efforts, which are evolving and increasing. So over time, I would expect our contribution to drop. It's going to take some time, however.
So I want to address the issue that my colleague from Louisiana just discussed, and kind of part of what victory looks like is a free and sovereign and secure Ukraine. Right? And so far that has come at no cost in American lives as far as uniformed service members, although there have been obviously many volunteers that have gone over and felt the need was great and sacrificed tremendously. In the context of my definition and kind of how you see victory, is victory for Ukraine possible?
Congressman, not losing is definitely possible, and I think that's the first step.
So if we're talking about a free, secure, sovereign Ukraine, the actions that we've taken so far, I mean, they've not lost yet, but how do we take it to the next level? If we want to get a meaningful peace that provides for a free, sovereign, secure Ukraine, what do we need to do in addition to what we've done so far?
Well, I think there's a military contribution to that, sir, of course, but I think that the principal questions would probably be outside of my lane.
Well, I'm talking in your purview, and briefly, obviously, do we need to provide them more stuff?
We need to continue to provide them the defensive mechanisms to prevent the heinous attacks that we've
provide
seen.
More intelligence?
Intelligence, air defense weapon systems, and then artillery systems and ammunition. Those are always the important things that they need.
And away from strategy, we have new munitions. We have the glide bombs. We have wire-guided munitions now, very similar to what the TOW is, but they have loitering capacity with the new drones. What are we doing to both develop that and also counter that in technologies? Obviously, you're not going to talk about anything classified, but do you feel like we're moving at pace for our newly developed weapon systems?
Yeah, Congressman, a general never feels like we're moving at an adequate pace when it comes to development of new weapon systems, especially in conflict. We continue to help our Ukrainian partners in their development of this stuff, but they have really, they've become the world experts in one-way drones, and they are very, very good at it. They're also very good at countering it, and are doing that. Our ability to learn from them is an important thing. A few minutes ago, a member asked about lessons learned and how we're incorporating those. One of the if you can find a silver lining in this tragic dark cloud of this war, we are learning an awful lot about the future of warfare and about Russia's capabilities as well.
I think they'll have great applications to Taiwan and the Straits as well when we're talking about legacy systems versus the newer technologies that are going to impact the battlefield. I'm almost out of time, but I want to take this time as you're nearing retirement just to say that no matter what happens, no matter how bad your uniform looks compared to the Marines or anything like that, you have one thing that you can always hang your hat on, and you have the coolest title ever, Supreme Allied Commander. Nobody can take that from you for the rest of your life. God bless you, Semper Fidelis. Good luck in your next career.
Thank you, sir.